As we've already seen, increments to family income early in childhood have a statistically and substantively important association with earnings later in life. Suppose we take the PSID and estimate an identical model of income effects, but substitute for adult earnings two behavioral outcomes: arrests and out-of-wedlock childbearing. Income early in life is not a significant predictor of either of these outcomes, which suggests that the positive effect of early childhood income on adult earnings is unlikely to be operating through some kind of problem behavior pathway. Let's keep expanding our list of adult outcomes. Early childhood is strongly linked to adult work hours. Something about avoiding poverty in the early years of life is enabling children to sustain full-time working careers in adulthood. With NIH funding, the PSID has added health questions in recent waves. Remarkably enough, our study has shown that income in the prenatal and birth years are unusually important in reducing the likelihood of obesity in adulthood. And ongoing work appears to show reductions in adult hypertension and arthritis as well. Perhaps research on childhood poverty should be spending as much time thinking about pathways related to health as achievement and behavior. Doing so would open up exciting new opportunities to interdisciplinary collaborations. They connect us to rich literature spanning psychology, neuroscience, and epidemiology, which point to detrimental consequences of in utero and very early life stressors on cognitive, social, emotional, and health outcomes. We've long known about the harm caused by in utero exposures to teratogens such as alcohol, but stressors ranging from earthquakes and partner violence have also been shown to affect the length of gestation and neonatal health. Gary Evans and his collaborators have highlighted associations between childhood poverty and allostatic load, a biological index of the cumulative wear and tear on the body, measured in the teenage years. Andrea Deniza and others are showing links between childhood stressors such as maltreatment and dysregulation of the immune system. These pathways challenge our well-worn model of poverty effects. Instead of the what money can buy and parenting stress pathways, linking childhood poverty to child and adolescent outcomes, we need more time in boxes. Poverty effects may begin prenatally and extend well into adulthood. The body's stress and immune systems become important pathways linking poverty with later outcomes. And the outcomes themselves don't fit neatly into the attainment and behavioral categories, but instead relate to an individual's ability to sustain a healthy and productive adult life. SRCD members are among the leaders in some of these emerging areas, but their work has not been embraced by most developmental researchers and is largely unknown to the majority of economists and sociologists. The payoffs to interdisciplinary collaboration using this expanded model of poverty effects could be quite high. For my second example of the virtues of interdisciplinarity, let me explore the outer reaches of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. As we expand outward from the child, we see family and peers, then the community and mass media. Further out is the macrosystem with its political and cultural influences. And wait, there's something else. There are the economic influences, and over there are the policy influences. They are so distant from the child in this child-centric model that it is tempting to follow the lead of astronomers in dealing with Pluto and classify them as Kuiper Belt objects rather than as worthy planets. But we do so at our peril. Let's think big about economics and child development. When sociologist Glenn Elder delivered his SRCD presidential address 14 years ago, he featured the connections between economic hardship and child development detailed in his landmark books, Children of the Great Depression and Children of the Land. But an even larger and more important set of macroeconomic forces are at work. As Claudia Golden and Larry Katz have documented in their wonderful 2008 book, The Race Between Education and Technology, technological change rewards the acquisition of skills from an evolving workforce. In the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, until about 1975, technology improved the productivity and pay of both higher and lower skilled workers. Since then, these rewards have shifted and fueled a massive increase in inequality, with large but little noticed consequences for child development. Let's look at changes in family income over the past half century and express all of our income amounts in today's dollars. In 1947, the income threshold separating the poorest 20% of families from everybody else was a little over $13,000. Between 1947 and 1977, the economic fortunes of poor families improved markedly, with incomes doubling to about $26,000. But between the mid-70s and now, technological change has favored only the most educated, as can be seen in the painfully slow growth from $26,000 to only $28,000 in the incomes of low-income families. What about the richest one-fifth of families? Between World War II and the late 1970s, their income doubled as well, from about $40,000 to $84,000. But in contrast to low-income families, the incomes of affluent families have continued to increase. Of course, really high-income families did even better. But by choosing the top 20%, I'm including 15 million children and providing a broader population view of child well-being. A key question for this audience is whether the powerful forces fueling inequality have affected the developmental fortunes of children. Sean Reardon examines this question using achievement test scores, which are one of the few developmental indicators that have been gathered consistently over the past 40 years. To get our bearings, let's look first at familiar trends in the black-white test score gap. This slide presents smooth data from the National Assessment of Education Progress, the NAEP. Among children born in the early 1950s, shortly before Brown versus the Board of Education, black children scored 1.25 standard deviations below white children when tested in 9th grade. Over the next 2 decades, as the quality of schools attended by blacks improved, these gaps narrowed by a remarkable half standard deviation, but have changed little since then. But now look at gaps defined by income, based in this case on various national achievement surveys. As with the race gap, we've smoothed the line in order to focus on trends. The specific comparison here is between test score gaps between children at the 10th and 90th percentiles of the income distribution. Among children born around 1950, test scores of low-income children lagged behind those of their better-off peers by a little over half a standard deviation. For children born 50 years later, this gap was twice as large. This is hugely important. 50 years ago, the race gap was much larger than the income gap. Now the reverse is true. Not surprisingly, the income gap in completed schooling has grown as well, also by half a standard deviation. All told, this inequality story means that the economic planet in the solar system is looking a lot more like Jupiter than Pluto. Understanding how increasing income inequality affects children's attainment and what might be done about it could fill a book. In fact, it is about to. Eric Warner waits until the last minute to produce the title that he likes on books published by Russell Sage, so it's as yet untitled. But Richard Murnane and I are editing this volume that includes Sean Reardon's analysis, as well as the work of many others describing the ways in which inequality works through labor markets, neighborhoods, families, and schools to affect children's educational attainment. I joined the book project midstream after the structure of its 24 chapters and 49 authors and co-authors had been determined. It is instructive to look at the disciplines of the 49 contributors. They include numerous sociologists and economists, 2 neuroscientists who help explain the role of experience in brain's development, and several interdisciplinary scholars, but no mainline developmental psychologists. This is symptomatic of the fact that, with the important exception of experimental intervention studies, policy-focused studies of family, neighborhood, school, labor market, and policy contexts published in developmental journals have little visibility outside of developmental sciences. In fact, apart from intervention studies, there are very few developmental articles focused on the effect of policy. Policy implications abound, but they are often inferred, often with leaps of logic, from analyses of the effects of conditions such as childcare quality or parenting that might be affected by policy change. To be sure, developmental research has an enviable experimental tradition with intervention studies that are widely known throughout the social and behavioral sciences. And as Aletha Houston observed in her 2007 SRCD presidential address, experimental studies of, for example, early childhood education programs are viewed as highly credible in Congress and in other policy arenas. But the scope and expense of random assignment policy experiments limits their use. Lacking genuine experiments, how can we study policy effects? Economists and some sociologists and epidemiologists have developed sophisticated quasi-experimental approaches for this task. But here again, in the absence of interdisciplinary collaboration with developmental psychologists, means that economic and sociological studies are quite unsophisticated with regard to developmental theory and measurement. In my view, use of natural experiments, greater use, holds the greatest promise for a new generation of policy-relevant developmental studies. Uri Bronfenbrenner and past SRCD President Sir Michael Rutter are among the advocates of natural experiments. They work by taking advantage of variation in key independent variables that are beyond the control of the family or the child being analyzed. As illustrated by the use of dizygotic and monozygotic twin births to estimate heritability, natural experiments have a long tradition in developmental research, but not for understanding the impacts of policy on children. Let me give an example. The U.S. Earned Income Tax Credit provides income supplements to low-income working families that can amount to as much as $5,600 per year, a huge boost to the incomes of families supported by minimum wage jobs. Suppose that we're interested in understanding whether income from the EITC promotes child development, but lack the resources to mount a randomized trial. Since we believe that increased family income improves child outcomes, we would expect to find that that children are better off with an EITC policy in place than they would otherwise be. And since we believe that one of the pathways to improve child well-being may involve reduced maternal stress, it would be valuable to be able to test for that as well. What data and tools can be used to answer this question?